On January 7th, 1970, Swedish cross-country skiers Arno Heinonen and Esko Viho were out training in the woods of Imjarvi, Finland for an upcoming competition. Arno was 36 years old at the time and working as a woodman, while Esko was aged 38 and worked as a farmer. Both men lived simple lives. However, that day, they would have one of the strangest alien encounters in the history of Finland. The incident produced adverse health effects in both men and was considered to be quite credible early on. However, one of the men, Arno, alleged to have continued contact with the beings, which led many to cast doubt on the original story. In this episode, we will explore this unbelievable 1970 alien encounter that happened in the city of Imjarvi, Finland. Around 4:45 in the afternoon, as the sun was setting, after cross-country skiing for most of the day, the two Finnish skiers decided to stop in a clearing and rest. The day was extremely cold, with complete visibility in the sky, and the two men were looking forward to wrapping up their training session and heading home. After about 5 minutes of standing in the clearing, the men began to hear a faint buzzing sound. They looked up to the north and saw a light which was moving toward them, and soon it began descending. As the light came closer and closer to the ground, soon the men saw that the light was surrounded by a reddish-grayish cloud. As the craft came down to about 50 feet, they noticed that inside the cloud sat some sort of craft or object. It was around 10 feet long and had a dome on top, appearing to be composed of some type of metal. The craft then began to hover over them while continuing to descend, and the men could now see the underside. There was a short tube protruding out from the center. Interestingly, the tube was very small, being only about 10 inches round. As the craft kept coming lower, the gray-reddish mist dissipated and the buzzing sound turned down to a faint noise. At this point, the craft was only around 10 to 12 feet above the men. Then, an extremely bright light shot down from the craft. The light lit up the snow and seemed to blacken the edges of it somehow. The light spread out as it descended and appeared to be around 2 feet in diameter on the surface. The two men were stunned, speechless, and not saying a word to one another during this time. Still, it's important to note they didn't appear to be scared. Then inside the light, a creature would suddenly appear. Neither man saw the being descend from the light, but rather just suddenly become visible. The being was quite small and thin, being shorter than 3 feet. It had on green overalls and also darker green boots. The being appeared to have a hooked nose and also was wearing some type of coned helmet. Neither man seemed to be able to recall the eyes, which are somewhat odd. This could be due to the bright light obscuring it somehow though. The creature was carrying some type of black box. There was some sort of bright yellow light coming out of it that was flashing. Initially, the light was shining between the two men and not hitting them directly. Then the being turned slightly, and the bright light hit Arno. At that time, a gray mist floated down into the forest, and something that appeared as sparks began flying from the area in the snow where the light was. The sparks, which were multicolored, hit the men, and soon the gray-red smoke was so thick that the men couldn't see the being or even each other. Then suddenly the men saw the white light from the craft shoot up, and both the light and the being disappeared. At the same time, the smoke vanished, along with the craft. The men were surprised by the events, but unlike most, they reported they weren't that scared. They were even telling some jokes during the event. However, they would soon come to realize this wasn't a laughing matter. Immediately after the craft vanished, both men experienced damaging physical effects. Arno tried to walk, but his leg was so numb that he fell in the snow. He recalled his right leg just gave out, since that probably had the most contact with the light. Arno was forced to sit down. Esko initially thought this was a joke, but soon came to realize that Arno was serious. Esko was forced to drag his friend down the rest of the mountain. They went around 3 kilometers and arrived at Arno's mom's house. She would later recall the men looked like they were in bad shape, but not really scared. Esko's face was red and swollen. Arno was in much worse shape though. His back was hurting as well as his joints. He soon was vomiting and his urine turned black. Things would only get worse for Arno though. He was treated by a doctor, but even after 10 days the symptoms remained. He couldn't work, was extremely lethargic, had trouble balancing, and began having problems with his memory too. Dr. Polly Kajanajo, who examined Arno, couldn't explain the black urine. He thought it could be blood in the urine, but he stated that that wouldn't last for months like Arno experienced. Esko would have adverse health effects too. He had issues with his eyes and headaches for days after the event and saw Dr. Kajanajo. Dr. Kajanajo thought the men could have been exposed to something radioactive. While the men made some incredible claims, there were reports of others seeing strange lights in the area that night as well. Elna Stellari, who worked on a farm around 10 kilometers away, reported seeing a strange light. Also, a boy in Paso reported seeing an odd light too. In June of 1970, the 2 men would revisit the site with the journalist. Oddly, when the men and the journalist arrived, the hands of all 3 began to turn red and swelled up. Arno would report getting a crippling headache as well. While the initial sighting was deemed pretty credible by ufologists, subsequent claims by Arno would come to damage the credibility of the case. After the initial sighting, Arno would claim to have been visited by the beings at least 23 more times. Arno has a number of incredible stories from his encounters, many of which seem outlandish. For example, on one encounter, Arno alleged he heard a female voice telepathically guide him to a secluded spot in the woods. There, he would meet a gorgeous woman, or what looked like a woman. She was around 5 feet tall, had blonde hair cropped to her shoulders, and blue eyes. The being hovered or floated over to Arno, communicating with him in Finnish. She told him she was 180 years old, although she looked 20. She went on to tell him that he had met several different types of aliens from her planet. Arno would claim to speak with the woman one more time. On his second meeting, Arno attempted to photograph her, and according to Arno, she disappeared right as the photo snapped. He also alleged he tried to take a photo of the craft, but as he was raising his camera, it flew out of his hands. Arno's accounts of his interactions and subsequent events have led many ufologists to doubt his story. Without question, the later events have hurt his credibility. For example, Arno alleges to have received a green pen from the beings, but then says he misplaced it. Also, the reports around the cameras have led many to cast doubt on his story. This has led some to believe the initial story was true, but the effects experienced by the initial encounter have damaged him psychologically. Some speculate this has led to delusions and hallucinations. Still, while many of Arno's later claims sound like fiction, the initial encounter does appear to have some credible elements. 1. Both men experienced severe adverse health effects for quite some time. These were cross-country skiers in peak condition, and the event left them in a very fragile state. It seems unlikely they would be able to fabricate this. In addition, there were 2 witnesses, and both their stories were extremely similar. It's important to point out too that it's possible Arno was telling the truth about the later events. Many of the stories have elements similar to other alien encounters, such as telepathic communication and beings that appear attractive. Could it be the case Arno liked the attention from the initial encounter and fabricated the later stories? It's surely a possibility. Unfortunately for Arno and Esko though, evidence for these close encounters of the third kind in the UFO community is based almost primarily on witness credibility, and after Arno told his later stories, he lost almost all the credibility he first had. Some of the best types of UFO cases involve sightings with many witnesses, while much more rare than UFO sightings with one or two witnesses, reports with a large number are taken much more seriously, even by skeptics. In Japan, in the early 19th century, a strange ship washed ashore on the beach. The incident was seen by many, and perhaps more importantly, was documented in various Japanese writings. Since then, it has led many to research and ask, what was this craft? And perhaps more importantly, who was this strange woman inside it? In this episode, we will investigate this Japanese incident, a case that came to be known as Utsuro-Bune, or the Hollow Ship Story. On February 22, 1803, several men were fishing just off the shores of Hariadoria Beach in the Hitachi region when they would spot a strange boat in the waves. The men noticed the ship wasn't big and decided to tow it back to shore. As they brought it back, people began to gather on the beach, wondering just what it was. Once it was ashore, they were able to observe the strange craft in more detail. It had a dome-like top that was colored dark red. The bottom was dome-shaped too, although more elongated, and was covered with something that resembled brass metal plates. The craft was around 11 feet tall and 18 feet wide, with windows covered by bars on the upper half. In general, it didn't look like anything that the fishermen nor anyone else had ever seen. What would happen next, though, would truly shock the onlookers. A young woman who appeared foreign and of European descent exited the craft. The woman was estimated to be around 5 feet tall. She had red hair and also had white hair extensions made of some type of fur. She appeared elegant and was wearing what appeared to be silk clothes. She also carried a box in front of her. The purpose of the box couldn't be ascertained by the Japanese citizens. All we know in regards to the box is that the woman was very protective over it and wouldn't let anyone touch it. The woman would begin speaking to the people. However, she wasn't speaking Japanese, and no one knew what she was trying to communicate. As a result, who she was and what she wanted was a complete mystery. As word reached the leader of the village, the town elder speculated that the woman might have been outcast from a foreign land because she had married against her father's will, or possibly she had cheated on her husband. At a crossroads, and not wanting to get drawn into a potential conflict if they helped her, the town elders decided to put her back in the ship and drag it out to sea. The strange boat was never seen again by the townspeople. Interestingly, this isn't the first time a case like this had happened in Japan during this time. Around the same time, sometime prior, there were reports of a strange ship similar in appearance washing up on a Japanese beach not too far away. In addition, a woman, similar to the one described, was on board the ship. Over the years, the story, and ones like it, have been examined by many due to the abundance of documents on the scene that day. In addition, there are other stories of hollow ships washing up around Japan during that time. Many of the details are very similar among the events. There's a number of documents that mention this story. In fact, several Japanese newspapers from the early 19th century tell very similar stories. These include Tales from the Rabbit Garden, published in 1825, Stories from Drifters, around 1835, and Dust of the Plume, from 1844. It's important to point out, too, that these are just several of the more well-known sources, as others exist, too. This incident has been explored and has raised questions around what exactly the ship was and who was the woman. We know several things. This event seemed very likely to occur, as multiple sources have documented around Japan. In addition, we pretty much know this woman wasn't from Japan based on her description, and also the ship didn't appear to be Japanese. That said, there are traditional Japanese boats known as Utsuro-Bune, which are circular, open log boats, but these are quite different than the descriptions of the hollow ship. Generally, There appears to be two main theories on who this woman was and what the ship was. The first is that the woman and ship were from some type of European country or other Western country. The description of the woman supports this theory. However, most of the facts around it don't make sense. If a woman was banished, it seems almost certain she would have died at sea, unless of course she was dropped off near the Sea of Japan. Also, by all accounts, the woman looked healthy. Was she dropped off with the intent to allow the Japanese to imprison her? Possibly, but this seems unlikely. This has led many to speculate and support the second theory. This is that the woman was an extraterrestrial and the craft somehow malfunctioned. It was reported there was strange writing inside it, and even though Japanese citizens wouldn't recognize English letters, it's a bit odd that there would be writing inside the craft. Some speculate that this was some sort of survival pod. It does bear a remarkable resemblance to the pods used by NASA astronauts when they return to Earth. Perhaps a craft malfunctioned mid-flight and the being jumped in this escape pod. The being description itself seems to support this theory too. She was said to be wearing expensive clothes and didn't appear to be unhealthy or malnourished. The last question in this story concerns what was the box. One thought is that it could have been some sort of tracking device and that it would help her to be found. Unfortunately, this case has no remaining physical evidence nor witnesses that can be interviewed. We do, though, have a treasure trove of documents indicating something strange washed up on the shore that day. Perhaps in time, we will discover another document that reveals more about this strange event and who exactly this woman was and what her ship was as well. In 1967 in Ririe, Idaho, two young men, Guy Tossi and Will Begay, were driving on Highway 26 when they would have an extraterrestrial encounter they would never forget. The case would have many of the hallmarks we see in alien encounters, yet is incredibly bizarre in terms of the being's behavior and description. While many might surely cast doubt on the story, it's important to point out that several farmers witnessed strange lights in the area, and one man revealed a very similar story to what Guy and Will reported. In this episode, we will examine this little-known alien encounter, the incredible story of Guy Tossi and Will Begay. On the evening of November 2nd, 1967, around 9:30 p.m., Will and Guy were driving on Highway 26, just outside the city of Ririe, Idaho. As the men were driving, suddenly, a bright white light flashed in front of them. The car, seemingly by itself, came to a sudden stop. Then, a strange craft emerged from the white light. It was some sort of saucer-shaped craft with a transparent dome. The craft wasn't large by any means, only being about 8 feet long and 3 feet tall. It flashed green and orange lights around the center ring. The bottom of the craft also had green and orange lights that were flashing too. The men could see two strange beings. One was facing the men while the other was turned sideways. Then what happened next would truly be shocking. The dome began to slowly open, and inside one of the creatures began to rise out and descend down to the ground below. The being was around 3 feet tall, and it wore some type of backpack. Its clothes were tight-fitting, and the being had 2 small eyes, large ears, and a slit for a mouth. Its face was heavily crinkled, an interesting feature which we will discuss later in the video. As the hideous creature stared at the frightened men, it began to walk toward the driver's side door. The being opened the door, and Will, who was driving, slid over to the passenger side. The entity then got in the car, and the car began to move as it was being pulled by the UFO. It went into a nearby wheat field, and as the men looked on terrified, it would be too much for Guy. He would jump out of the car once it stopped and took off running. Guy took off to a local farmer's home around a quarter mile away. The craft initially tried to follow him, but stopped after just a few seconds. Inside the car, a stunned Will looked upon the disgusting creature. It began trying to communicate with him in some type of unintelligible language. He would later recall it sounded like a bird chirping. Once the craft had given up chasing Guy, it returned, and the being came down to the surface. At this point, the other being got out of the car and the two hovered back up to their craft. The craft then took off, leaving in a quick zigzag pattern. At this time, Guy was reaching the home of local farmer Willard Hammond. Guy was out of breath and trying to explain what had happened. He wasn't making much sense to Willard and his family though, but Willard and Guy then headed back out to where Will was. Once they arrived, they would find a terrified Will sitting in the car. He had his eyes closed and was still sitting in the passenger seat. Will could barely speak, but soon both the men would tell Willard the entire story. From the time they saw the bright white light to when Guy returned was around 15 minutes, indicating this was a very short encounter. In the coming days, the men would report the matter to the police. After an investigation, it was discovered several other locals saw lights in the area that night. Also, one man who refused to be identified alleged to have an extremely similar experience as the men, with a being floating down to the surface. It was reported as well that on the night of the encounter, several farmers reported their cattle running off for no known reason. So what can we make of this unusual case? It's certainly an odd one, although by no means unprecedented. We've seen other alien encounter cases with extremely odd extraterrestrials. While most report encounters with greys and Nordic beings, there's certainly a good number of cases with odd beings. For example, a case we covered on this channel some time ago, the Kofu-fanged humanoids. While this case doesn't align exactly, there are some interesting similarities. In both cases, the beings were said to have extremely wrinkled skin and wear tight-fitted clothing. They were around the same height, and also both had pointy ears. In both cases, the beings arrived in small crafts with domes that were transparent. The Kofu-fanged humanoid case happened in 1975, just 8 years after this case. Still, though, the being's appearance seems to be different, with the Kofu-fanged humanoids having fangs and also brown skin. That said, could it be the case this wasn't the exact same species, but they were related somehow? For example, we know many animals in nature are different than the opposite sex, like male and female deers. Small UFO crafts with transparent domes are not unusual to be reported. Another case this was reported on in this channel was the West Midlands UFO sighting. In that case, though, they appeared to be Nordics in the seats. While the men didn't have any solid evidence of their encounter, this appears to be a pretty solid case. It's not known if they were taken, but based on the events, it seems more likely than not they weren't. What were the beings trying to do then? One theory is they simply made an attempt to communicate. One other thought is that they had planned to take the men, but for some reason, they decided not to. It's not known if these men had more experiences, but hopefully they were able to get over this traumatic event and live normal lives. During the 1950s, UFO sightings and alien encounters were prevalent around the world. While the United States appeared to be the epicenter of activity, Europe had a large number of unexplained UFO sightings. In particular, Italy experienced a number of incredible sightings, some of which we have covered on prior episodes on this channel, like the Cinnina case, or the 1954 football game in which thousands spotted a UFO over the stadium. In this episode, we will cover a UFO sighting, an alien encounter that occurred just prior to the 1954 football game. It is said to be one of the better known alien encounters in Italy. In time, this case became to be known as the 1950 Varese Incident. On the evening of April 24, 1950, Bruno Ficini, a mechanic, was working the late shift in his local factory during a violent thunderstorm. Bruno was 40 years old at the time and married with a young son. He lived right next to the factory, which was located in Varese, about 50 miles from the city of Milan. Around 10 p.m., once the rain and lightning stopped, Bruno stepped outside to have a cigarette. As he relaxed, he would soon see a strange light flashing in a field across the way. Bruno was somewhat concerned as the lights were where a high-voltage power line was. He believed the line, which supplied power to much of the town, may have been knocked down. He was concerned that a downed power line could be extremely dangerous, since children like his often played in the area. After not seeing the light for a few moments, he decided to head back. Just as he was turning around, he noticed the flashing lights once again. Bruno decided to walk to get closer and see what it was. As he got up closer, Bruno would see something next to the power line. It was some sort of craft, around 30 feet wide and 10 feet across. There was a small ladder in the middle, lit by a greenish light. Bruno could make out what he believed was a human. It appeared to be making repairs or welding something together. There were also two other figures. They all were wearing gray tight-fitted suits and helmets obscuring their appearance. At this point, Bruno believed they were humans and yelled out if they needed help. He believed it could have been some type of experimental craft, possibly American. They muttered something back, though he couldn't understand. Bruno would later state they spoke in a guttural language, which he couldn't make out. Despite this, Bruno indicated he thought they tried to wave him inside the craft. Not only was their language weird, but they also moved awkwardly. At this point, he was able to see more strange aspects of the UFO. He then realized these figures weren't human. He suddenly became terrified, panicked, and started running away. At this point, one of the beings shot Bruno with a ray of light. The beam of light knocked him to the ground, and Bruno hit his head on a rock. As he laid there bleeding, he could see the ladder go up into the craft and the light coming through a door. The buzzing around intensified, and the craft took off into the sky. The following day, Bruno reported his encounter to the police. At the scene, there were things indicating something did happen the night before. Police found burn patches on the ground and indentation marks of something very heavy. Also, police discovered some weird green pieces of a metal-like substance. Bruno believed this was from the welding, and that the green pieces of debris were leftovers of the process. The fragments were analyzed, and the results concluded that the fragments were an anti-friction material containing several types of metal along with a lubricant. One test revealed some sort of unknown metal. It was a yellow-white color, but was not any type of element found on Earth. A photo was taken after the event of Bruno with his clothes from that night. In the photo, the clothes appear to be blackened somewhat. Bruno received quite a bit of media attention after the incident and was interviewed multiple times after the event. It is said that Bruno's story has remained consistent over the years. Still, with many reports on the matter, it appears some details may have been lost in translation. For example, the outfit the beings are wearing is said in some reports as being more like a spacesuit than a dive suit. Also, some reports say that Bruno was at home, while others say he was nearby. His home was right next to the factory, and this could have been something misinterpreted somehow. Still, what can we make of this case? Bruno's case certainly seems realistic and has many elements we have seen in other UFO sightings and alien encounters. The one interesting detail to call out is the buzzing sound. This is a unique detail and something we've seen in other cases. On this channel, we covered at least 2 episodes where we saw this. This includes the Imjarvi, Finland alien encounter, and also the Utsuro-Bune incident. In addition to being a pretty credible witness, there was evidence at the scene. Police would find massive marks on the ground, and the results of the material discovered were inconclusive. In sum, this case appears to have some very credible aspects. On February 5th, 1971, two young men working as lumberjacks would have a bizarre encounter with an extraterrestrial. Peter Aliranta, then age 21, and Esko Juhani Snek, then age 18, were working out in the forest in Kinnula, Finland, wrapping up a hard day's work. This case features many similar and strange characteristics we've seen on other episodes on this channel. In today's episode, we will examine this strange close encounter of the third kind, a case that has become to be known as the 1971 Kinnula, Finland incident. Around 3 p.m. on February 5th, 1971, Peter Aliranta and Esko Snek were wrapping up their day of work when Peter would spot something strange off in the distance. There was a strange saucer-shaped metallic craft hovering up in the treetops. The craft was around 15 feet in diameter, and protruding from the bottom were 4 landing legs sticking out, each about 6 feet. As Peter watched, the craft descended down around 50 feet in front of him. Then, a round door opened in the bottom half of the craft. At this time, Esko Snek turned around, was still running his saw, and was unaware of what was happening. As Aliranta stared at the door, a small being would come through and hover down to the ground. The being was tiny, only around 2 feet tall, and wore a one-piece green-covered suit. It had a green helmet with some sort of black visor obscuring its face. It didn't have any hands and had green boots as well. It began to move toward Peter. Peter would later recall the being moved in a robotic fashion, very stiff. It also must have been very light, as it barely sunk in the snow when it walked. Peter wasn't scared of the being though. He started up his chainsaw and began walking toward the alien, ready to strike. At this point, Esko Snek heard the chainsaw and turned around. The being and Peter kept approaching each other like they were playing some sort of game of chicken. Then around 20 feet apart, the alien turned around and began moving back to the craft. Peter, feeling confident, then began to chase the being back to the UFO. As Peter ran in the snow, he noticed several humanoids looking through the windows. Once the being got back to the craft, it began to hover up toward the hole it came out of. An aggressive Peter continued his charge though, and grabbed the boot of the being. However, once he grabbed it, the boot was scalding hot, and it burned his hand. Peter let go, moved back, and watched the being hover inside the UFO. The craft then began to make a buzzing sound and rose into the sky. Moments later, the object flew away and vanished. The whole event only lasted around 3 minutes. The two men felt weak after the event and had some difficulty breathing. Peter's burn marks were said to be visible for months after the event. Still, what can we make of this unusual encounter? It appears the case was investigated and was published in a 1971 article in the Flying Saucer Review. Still, it's not known how much of their story was challenged during the investigation. Probably the most questionable part of the story is that Peter chased the being as it was retreating. It seems this part of the story could have been either exaggerated or fabricated. It must be pointed out, though, that we followed many cases in which extraterrestrials expressed their discomfort with mankind's use of violence. Some abductees have even reported being told the beings haven't made themselves known because they believe that we are too violent. Could it be the case, despite the ETs being far more advanced, they are frightened of conflict? It is also certainly possible and probably likely the being was a robot and maybe was programmed to avoid conflict. Despite Peter's claims, the case does have similar characteristics that we've seen in other cases. For one, The fact the men reported a buzzing sound is a unique detail we see in quite a number of cases. Also, the size and shape of the craft are very typical of what many see. Which raises the question, what did the beings want then? Generally, there are two theories as far as what their intentions were. The first is that they came to communicate with the men. The second is they came to abduct them. While both are surely possible, it doesn't seem like, based on the information provided, one is more likely. There's quite a number of cases of beings, especially in the wilderness, attempting to communicate with humans, and in some of these cases, it doesn't appear they abducted anyone. It's not known what happened to the men after the event, and whether they had any more encounters or any more UFO sightings. Every so often, a case presents itself as so strange and unbelievable, it seems like it almost has to be true. In today's case, the witness tells an incredible story, one that isn't backed by evidence, but yet shares common characteristics with other alien encounters and UFO cases. The man alleges time distortion, as well as revelations from the beings regarding their whereabouts. In addition to this, the witness claims the beings communicated with him in an extremely odd manner. He would describe this as coded thoughts. In this episode, we will explore the multiple alien encounters of Pierre Monnet, as well as the messages he received from the beings. While Pierre alleged to have multiple contact with the beings, his first encounter happened in 1951 in the Vaucluse department of France. In July 1951, after spending the evening with his fiancée, then 19-year-old Pierre hopped on his bicycle and began cycling through the town to his home. As Pierre cycled through the town, he would pass the town clock. It was 1:30 a.m., and soon he planned to exit the city. However, then something happened. It's not clear what exactly occurred here, but the next thing Pierre remembers is he was bicycling, yet he was several miles further along and outside the city. It was as if he had been instantly transported. At this point, Pierre continued to bike down the gravel path and noted he felt compelled to go down it like some unknown force was pulling him. Pierre got off his bike and began walking at this point with his bike next to him. He even reported that he felt like he was floating, yet he wasn't sure this actually happened. As he approached a curve and walked around it, he would then see a light glowing about 200 feet ahead. Up ahead, Pierre spotted a craft. It was disc-shaped and hovering around 30 to 50 feet above the ground. The UFO was about 60 feet long, 10 feet high, and had a dome top. The craft was emitting a blue-white light and appeared to be silver beneath. Interestingly, he would note that the light seemed to move and didn't appear to be coming from any sort of light source, like a bulb. Still, Pierre would continue to walk toward the ship, and now a deafening silence was in the air. Needless to say, Pierre was in a state of shock, and soon things would become even more strange for him. Right below the ship, Pierre would spot 4 humanoid beings. They wore tight-fitted silver suits, and all the beings appeared pretty similar. They were all around 6 feet tall, with bare feet, well-built, and had blonde hair to their shoulders. It appears here that Pierre encountered Nordic aliens or tall whites, but Pierre had a different opinion, at least initially, about the beings. Pierre thought the beings were robotic, not biological, since they were so similar. This is in contrast to many Nordic reports where witnesses believe the beings are biological in nature. Pierre walked up to the beings as they looked friendly. As he got close, the beings stood, and then all at the same time, they raised their right hand up with their palms up to shoulder length. This scared Pierre. However, as he started to retreat, the beings spoke to him telepathically. Oddly though, they didn't speak to him in French, but used what Pierre would describe as coded thoughts. Then after what Pierre would describe As being about 30 minutes, the coded thought stopped and Pierre would come out of his trance-like state. He looked up and saw the bottom part of the craft had opened up, although he didn't see or hear this happen. There was a white-orange light coming through, and the being suddenly disappeared, seemingly going into the craft. Things would only get more confusing for Pierre here, though. He looked at his watch, and it said 1:30, as if no time had passed at all. He was shocked and couldn't believe it, so he decided to bike back to the town clock because he thought maybe his watch had broke. When he arrived, he would be stunned to see that the time was 1:35 a.m. Pierre then headed home, and being still perplexed and worked up at what had happened that night, he thought maybe he was just in a strange dream. He decided to wake up his mother in the middle of the night just to make sure he remembered everything. When he woke up the next day and went to eat breakfast, his mother yelled at him for the late night wake up. At this point, Pierre knew the prior night wasn't a dream, but actually did happen. Over the following weeks, Pierre was able to conclude he had at least 20 minutes of missing time unaccounted for. However, the coded thoughts he received that night would start to become more clear for him. It actually took years for him to piece together the isolated messages, but when he did, it revealed much more about that night. One message was a warning to him not to walk any closer to the beings. Another message was they want the best thing for living beings, especially if they are not aggressive. The entities also informed Pierre he would suffer some short-term problems with his nervous system, and in time the message they intended to give him would become much clearer. Another coded thought was around contact with other humans. The beings stated that many people do not want to speak with them, and those that do are not believed. Probably the most important coded thought, though, was the beings informed Pierre they were going to experiment on him, doing him no harm, and that he wouldn't remember the event for some time. One of the tests was that they were going to regenerate his cells, which the being said would extend his life to around 120 years. Still, this wouldn't be the only encounter that Pierre had. Pierre would allege to see a craft when he was serving in the French military and was stationed overseas. In addition to this, he stated in June 1974, he drove to a gas station, and as he was filling up his car, he would spot two men who looked exactly like the men he saw in 1951. They looked over at him in unison, and soon they began sending coded messages once again to him. While Pierre spoke with several ufologists, an interview that happened in 1978 was incredibly bizarre. Pierre spoke with ufologist Timothy Good and would recall some unbelievable things. According to him, he would begin receiving telepathic communication from the beings again in 1977, and they revealed several things to him. One message was that the beings came from a star named Vega, which had 14 planets around it, 9 of which were inhabitable. Another message was that the beings had bases on Mars, our moon, and even planet Earth as well. Pierre would allege the beings were able to hide their bases from visible detection by using some sort of extremely powerful magnetic field. According to Pierre, the beings were able to use their technology to essentially be invisible. With such incredible claims and zero proof, what can we conclude from Pierre's case? Was this just a man who had seen too many science fiction movies? Or did these events actually happen to him? Skeptics will immediately point out that Pierre alleged to have a procedure done that would extend his life to 120, yet he died in 2009 at the age of 78 and seemingly of natural causes. In addition, there's not much to back up his fantastical claims. Could it be the case that Pierre did have these encounters, yet he completely mistranslated the messages? This surely seems possible, as many of the characteristics in his encounters are what we see all too often. For example, the craft was silver and disc-shaped with a dome on top. Also, the beings wore one-piece tight-fitted suits, another common trait reported in other cases. One of the more interesting aspects around this case was the coded messages. Why did they use coded messages and not just communicate clearly? Or did they wipe his mind, and was Pierre somehow able to regain information he wasn't supposed to know? While Pierre alleges that time seemed to be frozen, this is something that we've seen before. On a prior episode, we covered one case in 1977 where a Chilean soldier named Armando Valdez was on patrol when he and his team spotted a white bright light. Valdez went to investigate, and his team watched him vanish into thin air. After 15 minutes he returned, seemingly from nowhere, and looked extremely rough. Valdez was clean shaven earlier in the day, but now had a full beard. By all accounts, it seemed like he had been gone for 5 days, but according to the soldiers, he was only missing for 15 minutes. While many questioned whether Pierre was legit, he never wavered on his story. He also was quite adamant that government officials, as well as the military, were nervous about the crafts and didn't know what to do and had lied to citizens since day one. He would also state many humans had been contacted up to present day. While Pierre could have misinterpreted the communication and perhaps even lied about everything, he does seem to hit the nail on the head around UFO disclosure. On Sunday, October 28, 1973, a young truck driver would show up in a hospital in Bahia Blanca, Argentina, in a complete state of amnesia. The man did not know his name, where he lived, any family, and had no personal, identifiable information on him. The confused hospital staff examined the man to see if he had any head injuries, but other than a bad headache, there was nothing evident. The man was found wandering aimlessly around asking for help, and soon a good Samaritan would take him to the hospital. In several days, the man's memory would come back, and soon he would realize he had an encounter with something strange that night. In this episode, we will explore the alien encounter of Dionisa, Llanca. On the evening of Saturday, October 27th, 1973, around 6 p.m., Argentinian truck driver Dionisa Llanca woke up from sleeping and began getting ready. Llanca lived in a small cottage by himself in Calle Chubat, which was around 10 minutes from Bahia Blanca. Since he would be driving all night, he ate dinner around 10 p.m. and then around 12:30 p.m. headed out the door to drive toward Rio Gallegos, which was around a 2-day trip. Llanca was used to driving all night, and on this trip, he would be hauling construction materials. Right before leaving, Llanca would see his right rear tire was low on air. He considered changing it, but thought it could make the trip. This decision would change his life forever. Shortly into his drive, Llanca would notice the tire was much worse than he thought. He had no choice but to pull over and change the tire. At 1:15 a.m., on the dark, deserted road, Llanca began pulling down his tools and began to change the tire. It was cold and extremely dark, and Llanca was upset he didn't stop and change it at one of the gas stations he had passed. Then behind the truck, a bright yellow light would suddenly light up the entire road. Llanca was busy trying to fix the tire, so he didn't realize the extent of the light at first. He thought it was just another truck with its high beams on. However, the brightness intensified, and Llanca soon realized this was something else. The light then changed to blue. Llanca tried to get up, but couldn't. His legs were paralyzed. He was on his knees, but was able to turn his head. As he did, he would spot a strange oval-shaped craft hovering. Even more shocking, though, to the right of his shoulder behind him, 3 humanoid beings stood. The beings were around 5 feet tall, with blonde hair, and had tight-fitted silver coveralls. They sported yellow boots and had long black gloves. They had no belts or helmets. There were 2 men and 1 woman. The beings looked human, except their eyes. They were more slanted than ours. Llanca would also note they had large foreheads as well. The beings would stand and talk among themselves in a strange language. It sounded like a strange chirping sound. Still paralyzed at the time, Llanca was unable to get up. Things would get even worse for him, though. He soon realized he was unable to speak or move his face. Then nothing could prepare Llanca for what happened next. One of the beings grabbed him by his collar and easily lifted him into the air. Llanca tried to talk and communicate, but still wasn't able to. As he was suspended in the air, one of the other beings stepped over and it stuck some sort of device into his finger. Llanca would state this didn't hurt, but it did produce a little bit of blood. After this, he would pass out, and this is where the mystery begins. Sometime between 2 to 3 a.m. on the same night, Llanca would wake up in a rail yard. This spot was around 6 kilometers from where Llanca's truck had broken down, and his truck was still there. Llanca began walking toward the lights and would soon come upon a road. He would appear to wander for some time and eventually end up in the city. The man who dropped him off stated Llanca was mumbling and described him as being catatonic or like a robot. That morning, Dr. Ricardo Smirnoff, a forensic surgeon, would examine Llanca and recalled the strange incident. Smirnoff would state, "I am a forensic surgeon. I had rotating duty on Sunday the 28th. About 9:30, Dr. Alpotero at the Spanish hospital called me and said that he had a curious case. I arrived at the hospital around 10:15 and saw a young man of about 25 or 26 years of age in a total state of amnesia. He could remember nothing of his past. He did not know who he was, where he was born, who his parents were, or anything about his past. He cried continually and asked what town he was in. The doctor told me that a man had left him at the hospital after encountering him wandering in the center of the city like a robot and asking everyone he met where a police box was. At first he thought he had an automobile accident on the road. He changed this as he had no injuries. When I touched his head or came near his hand, he drew back instinctively as though it would produce pain. He had a bad headache in the right parietal temporal area. I notified the police and had him admitted to the municipal hospital. In the days that followed, Llanca's memory would come back, or most of his memories. He was able to recall the encounter with the beings and regained his memories around his personal life. Still, it's not known what happened after he blacked out and got to the rail yard. The distance was over 6 kilometers, so this raises the question, did he walk there, or was he put there by the beings? Mathematically, it's possible he walked there, even in his catatonic state, as a person could do this walk in 1 hour and 15 minutes, or possibly even quicker. If you recall, he encountered the beings at 1:15 a.m. and was in the rail yard sometime between 2 to 3. That said, we should point out, being in a catatonic and paranoid state like he was, this probably would have slowed his walking speed. That said, it's surely possible that he did walk the walk by himself, and there was no abduction, but it's not known. As for the encounter, this case appears to have many credible aspects. First, the beings approached the man on the highway, and it involved a bright bluish light. This is a scene we see all too often, and crafts approaching people on desolate roads we see time and time again. Also, the beings appear to be Nordic aliens. All three are reported as having blonde hair and large foreheads, as well as tight-fitted silver suits. Those are characteristics many report when seeing these beings. One interesting aspect of this case is the chirping sound. Not too long ago, on a case we covered on this channel, the 1967 Ririe, Idaho alien encounter, 2 young men would report this strange characteristic. While driving on a desolate highway, they would encounter strange beings who communicated through chirping. It's a strange coincidence, although the beings in this case did not appear to be Nordics, as they appeared to have wrinkly skin. That said, perhaps these 2 different species share a common communication manner. It's said that Llanca is a simple man with no interest in UFOs. In the days he was interviewed by ufologists, he was said to be extremely somber and did not smile once. Hospital staff characterized him as traumatized and innocent. Of course, skeptics will argue these symptoms are easy to fake, and he may have done this for the attention. Still, by all accounts, this was the only close encounter of the third kind that Llanca had, and he was able to move on from his experience. On April 18, 1961, around 11 a.m., Wisconsin resident Joe Simonton was sitting down and eating a late breakfast when he would have one of the weirdest alien encounters in history. At the time, Simonton resided in the town of Eagle River and was working as a chicken farmer. As Joe was eating, he would suddenly hear a strange sound outside. It sounded like a jet being throttled back, and Joe would later describe it as sounding like knobby tires on wet pavement. Joe quickly headed outside and was stunned to see a UFO drop out of the sky. The craft was silver, 12 feet tall, and around 30 feet in diameter. Joe noted it was incredibly bright. He would later state it was brighter than chrome. On one edge of the craft, there were what appeared to be exhaust pipes around 6 inches in diameter. The craft continued descending and would land. Then nothing could prepare Joe for what happened next. A hatch would open on the side. He would spot 3 beings. He described them as having dark skin and looking Italian. They were around 5 feet in height and weighed around 125 pounds each. He aged the being as somewhere between 25 to 30 years old. The beings wore dark blue uniforms and had turtleneck collars. They also wore helmets and were clean shaven. The visitors would next communicate with Joe through telepathy. They had a silver-shaped jug that was around 12 inches tall and had 2 handles. Joe stated the jug seemed to be made of the same material as the craft. The beings would communicate to Joe that they needed or wanted water. They handed the jug to him, and Joe would state the jug was absolutely beautiful. The strange metal-like material weighed less than steel, but more than aluminum. Joe left the beings and headed down to the water pump he had in his basement. After filling up the jug, he went back up, still in awe of it. As he got to the craft, Joe had to lean against it to hand it back, and he would get a better look as to what was happening inside the craft. In it, it was black, and there appeared to be 3 multicolored instrument panels for driving the ship. Most oddly, though, he noticed that one of the beings appeared to be grilling something that resembled pancakes. One of the beings would notice Joe seeing the pancakes and grab 3 for him. The pancakes were small, about 3 inches in diameter, and perforated with small holes. After the being, who Joe thought was the leader, handed him the pancakes, he touched his forehead, and what Joe would later interpret was the being's way of showing gratitude. The leader then closed the craft. It would rise up about 20 feet and then instantaneously shot off to the south. It was such a powerful blast of air that it bent the tops of the pine trees in the nearby area. Next, Joe would try one of the pancakes. He would later state it tasted like cardboard. The other 2 pancakes he gave to Judge Frank Carter. Carter would send the pancakes off to be tested. He sent them to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon, or NICAP. NICAP, though, refused to test them. This upset Carter, who wanted to give a lecture on the experience. Carter was said to be an avid UFO enthusiast. Despite NICAP not wanting to get involved, the case drew the attention of J. Allen Hynek. During this time, Hynek was an astronomer at Northwestern University. After studying many cases and investigating them, he became convinced that UFOs are real. This would lead him to find his own group to study them. The group would even take over NICAP's files after they went under. Hynek would investigate many cases, such as the Red Bluff UFO incident and also the Lonnie Zamora case, both of which we covered on this channel. Most notably though, he created the Hynek classification system, which is still in effect today. This is the Close Encounters scale. Hynek would push to get the strange pancakes tested. A group of scientists from Northwestern and the Air Force's Technical Intelligence Center analyzed them. The group would discover them to be made of elements of this planet. More specifically, the pancakes were made of flour, sugar, and grease. The Air Force would investigate the other aspects of the case and conclude the following. Simonton answered questions directly, did not contradict himself, insisted on the facts being exactly as he stated, and refused to accept embellishments or modifications. He stated he was sure that we wouldn't believe him, but he didn't care whether he was believed. He stated simply that this happened, and that was that. Interestingly, the report also stated the only flaw is the disappearance of the craft in 2 seconds. This is really odd for a number of reasons, most notably because in so many cases witnesses report seeing craft flying off at incredible speeds. Sometimes they fly so fast that some witnesses report the craft disappearing into thin air. Other Air Force personnel would investigate Joe as well. Some believed him, while others thought he may have hallucinated the event due to an injury. One interesting theory comes from Lloyd Mallon, who wrote a book titled The UFO Handbook for Air Force Personnel. Mallon stated the Air Force investigated one popular rumor that swirled in the community that was published by Raymond Palmer, the publisher of Pulp Flying Saucer and several other science fiction magazines. Palmer wrote that Joe was hypnotized by someone who was hired by a local real estate agent and given the pancake story. This was done so he would repeat it and be able to bypass any sort of lie detector. The hope from the real estate agent, according to the rumor, was that it would draw attention to the area and boost business. Still, most look past Palmer's theory due to the reputation of Palmer. Palmer was considered somewhat of a nut job even in UFO circles. For example, one of Palmer's beliefs was that UFOs came from a secret Hollow Earth civilization ruled by a race called detrimental robots, which he called Deros. Palmer believed the Deros manipulated humanity with some sort of rays he called thought rays. Palmer was said to have only one source for his theory, and it came from the memory of a Pennsylvania welder. While there weren't any other witnesses that saw what Joe saw, one interesting account comes from someone in the area. About the same time Joe was visited, a local insurance agent named Savino Borgo was driving along Highway 70 about a mile from Joe's farm. According to Borgo, he saw what he later described as a flying saucer rising diagonally into the air and flying parallel with the highway. What can we make of the Joe Simonton case? By all accounts, Joe appeared to be very credible and also told the story in a consistent manner. He was interrogated by not only military officials, but also local police. Many who knew Joe for decades and said they believed him and that he was also very reliable. The story of Joe Simonton is surely an interesting one for a number of reasons. First and foremost are the pancakes he was given. While they appear to be of terrestrial origin and made from ordinary ingredients, that's not definite proof that this encounter didn't happen. Joe kept the pancakes, and if he did try and fabricate the encounter, why would he send them off so they could be tested? The pancakes seem to support the theory these beings were biological in nature just like us, needing energy. This leads to the next strange aspect of this case, the water jug. Why would the beings need such a small amount of water, and couldn't they get this water themselves? As many have joked on the case, maybe the pancake batter was too thick. Cases where beings need water, though, are not unheard of. On this channel, we covered a close encounter of the third kind, called the Utsuro-Bune case. In that case, the witness reported the craft landed next to a river, and several hoses came out of the ship, sucking up the water. It's not clear why they needed the water, though. One other intriguing aspect of this case is the beings. Usually when people report encounters with aliens that are human-like, they're Nordics. Nordics have blonde hair, blue eyes, are tall, and are known for being physically attractive. These beings, though, Joe described as Italian-looking. This is not something seen that often. The encounter itself seemed to be amicable, although some have stated they believe the pancake was actually some sort of scientific experiment. Did it contain some sort of ingredients that were put in Joe's system to track him? Many don't think so, as they believe they wouldn't actually need to do this. While the most popular theory is that this was ETs, some have suggested this was a military experiment. The beings appeared human, but not Nordics. Also, the pancake ingredients were of this planet. Perhaps the military was testing something with the pancake. In general, this case surely is an odd one, but one that surely deserves attention. Unfortunately, there was only one witness to the event, although he sure seems credible. It said Joe had more encounters after this, which isn't that unusual. Unfortunately, the attention and constant harassment from his story seemed to deter him from reporting more encounters. In 1965, one of the most famous alien encounters of the decade would happen in Valençol, France. Not only was a significant amount of evidence found at the scene, but also the witness was considered to be highly credible. The case also features characteristics we see time and time again in alien encounters, such as the description of the craft and the beings. In this episode, we will examine the 1965 alien encounter of Maurice Masse. Around 5 a.m. on July 1st, 1965, French farmer Maurice Masse woke up and got dressed in preparation for his workday. Maurice was a lavender farmer in the small village of Valençol, France, located just outside Nice. That morning, Maurice was on somewhat of an alert as someone had been stealing lavender from his fields. Maurice and his father had reported the matter to the police, but no one had been caught. Around 5:45 a.m., Maurice headed out to the fields and decided to have a quick cigarette before work. Then Maurice would hear a strange sound in the sky that sounded like whistling. He thought it could be a helicopter, and as he glanced around, he would see a strange object sitting in one of the fields. He was around 200 feet away at the time, and believing it to be the people who were taking his lavender, he began walking over to get a better view. As he was walking toward the UFO, he would spot two small humanoids. He believed it was children, but as he got closer, he would realize whatever it was wasn't human. Maurice would make out more and more details on both the craft and the strange beings. The craft was oval-shaped, reminding Maurice of a rugby football. It had a cupola on top, not centered with the top of the object, but stretching further to the rear of the end, or to Maurice's right. The UFO stood on 6 thin silver legs in a circular arrangement, originating from the middle of the craft's underside, and they bowed outwards a little over a meter or so. In the center of the legs, there was a central pivot which stuck into the ground beneath the object. Maurice could see inside an open doorway and saw what appeared to be 2 seats inside. The beings were a little less than 4 feet tall and had on tight-fitting, gray-greenish suits, but no head covering. Their skin was grayish-white, and their heads were pumpkin-like, disproportionate to their bodies. The eyes were large, black, and slanted around the face. Interestingly, Maurice would state that the eyes seemed to convey human emotion. The mouth appeared to be a slit, and their noses were just 2 dots. The beings had a sharp chin, and interestingly, the ETs were reported to make sounds like they were grumbling. The grumbling sounds seemed to come from their throats, but Maurice believed it was some kind of communication, although he did not actually see their mouths move. The being suits each possessed a belt, one which contained a small container on the left and a larger one on the right. As Maurice got about 15 feet away, suddenly one of the beings would point a pencil-like device that paralyzed him. Strangely, Maurice was still standing up as he was paralyzed. He could still feel his heartbeat and blink, but couldn't move any major muscles. The pencil-like device is something we have seen in prior episodes on this channel, and we will discuss it later in the video. As Maurice was paralyzed, the beings were collecting and seemingly analyzing the lavender plants. Maurice would later describe their movements as rising and falling in space, like bubbles in a bottle, without apparent support. Or he would describe them as sliding along bands of light. They were reported by Maurice to be outside for around a minute once he was paralyzed. The beings would then head back into the craft. The door closed, and Maurice would describe it like the front part of a wooden file cabinet. Maurice stated he could see them looking at him from inside the cockpit while the legs swirled and eventually retracted. A thump then came from the central pivot, and the machine lifted off, floating silently away. At around 20 meters from the landing site, the object simply vanished from view. In Maurice's words, one moment the thing was there, and the next moment it was not there anymore. At this time, Maurice was still paralyzed and couldn't move. It would soon begin to wear off though, and after around 20 minutes the paralysis ended. One ufologist who examined the case, Amy Michelle, suggested that the paralysis was a form of hypnotic suggestion in nature, as if it had been muscular paralysis. Maurice would have died within 20 minutes he spent in that state. There's multiple cases we've covered where entities seem to be able to hypnotize abductees and experiencers. Usually though, people are not standing up during this time. After the paralysis ended, Maurice would head back into town and go to a local restaurant. He told the owner his story, who called the cops. They and Maurice would head out to the site, and there were imprints that were found in the soil where the craft had been. The traces present when Maurice and company returned from town consisted of a flat imprint just over a meter in diameter. In the center of it, where the central pivot had been, was a cylindrical hole around 30 centimeters deep and 15 centimeters in diameter. From the hole radiated 4 flat grooves, making an X shape. Each groove was 2 meters long and 25 centimeters deep. Strangely, the soil at the spot was of near liquid consistency, despite the fact that it had not rained for some time. When Maurice returned to the spot later that evening, the soil surrounding the central trace had turned to the consistency of cement. Seemingly, the craft had changed the composition of the soil, with it becoming hard as rock. In time, the area would develop a circular patch where lavender refused to grow, although a few weeds remained. Maurice even replowed the area, but the lavender refused to grow there. Lavender plants around the perimeter were stunted and withered looking. More evidence that something bizarre had happened. The calcium content of the soil at the site was found to be much higher than that of surrounding soil. It's said that traces of the UFO were found on lavender plants stretching for around 400 meters from the site, heading in the direction of the town of Monnet. In the weeks that followed, Maurice would experience strange physical effects too. He was constantly exhausted and couldn't stay awake for more than 4 hours. It's not known if Maurice was taken aboard the craft during the time he was paralyzed. Despite being paralyzed by the humanoid beings and some later health problems, Maurice said he had a positive feeling about his encounter. It's important to note Maurice was well known and highly respected in his community. In addition, all the local authorities who examined his case reached the conclusion that he was telling the truth. That said, what can we make of Maurice's case? The case was investigated by UFO researcher Amy Michelle. Michelle would present documents and data to him in regards to a landing that happened a year prior in the country of Italy. Maurice showed this photo when he believed there was no more information he could extract from Maurice. After Maurice saw the photo, Michelle would write, "The effect produced on him was fantastic. I had the impression that, on seeing the image, Maurice was at his last gasp, as though he had just looked upon his own death. At first he thought somebody had photographed his machine. When he learnt that this one had been seen in the United States by a policeman, he seemed relieved and said to me, 'You see then that I wasn't dreaming and that I am not mad.'" Simply stated, the Maurice Masse case appears to be a legitimate one, with many characteristics we see in other cases. The first similarity is the reports of the beings. They wore tight-fitted green suits and appeared as gray aliens. Often grays are said to be wearing silver suits, but a good number of cases report green suits as well. The craft was egg-shaped or rugby-shaped. The size and description of it is something we see time and time again in other cases. There's various theories on what these smaller ships are, but most think they are exploratory crafts that dock with a larger mothership that probably handle the long-distance space travel. Another theory is the ships might actually have the capability for intergalactic travel. Still, some have reported seeing these massive motherships in the sky as well. Amazingly, some have reported the crafts to be miles long. Critics often state these sightings are an optical illusion, but in some cases these massive crafts are seen from different vantage points. One of the more interesting things and unique details of this case concerns the pencil-like object the beings used to paralyze him. Another case, the 1951 Salzburg, Austria alien abduction, which we covered on this channel, involved a soldier who was abducted by aliens. In that case, the soldier reported to be paralyzed by a pencil-like device and then taken aboard their ship. It's important to note the being was described differently in that case, having grayish-white skin with bug eyes. That said, it seems that there is a possible connection between these two cases. The man was paralyzed standing up and also was floated up to the ship. The man in that case also ran into the being on a dark path, leading some to believe that he stumbled upon something he shouldn't have. Paralysis is something reported quite often from people who have had close encounters with extraterrestrials. Many alien abductee cases follow the same pattern. An individual wakes up in the middle of the night paralyzed and sees several gray aliens. He or she then floats out through a window or up through the roof. Whatever these entities are, they seem to possess the ability to allow people to move through solid surfaces. The person then winds up on a metal table and medical experiments, sometimes horrific ones, are performed. Next thing they know, they end up back in their beds. Many believe the number taken is much higher than reported. This is because people believe the experience was just a bad dream, or simply they need to move on with their lives. It's even speculated by some that UFO disclosure hasn't happened because of the abductions. How could the government possibly respond to these reports, especially when they seem completely unable to prevent them? Others theorize that the government cut a deal to allow the abductions in exchange for technology. Coming back to the case, while Maurice might not have been abducted, it could have occurred. There are cases where beings seem to be able to manipulate time. A case we recently covered from France, the Pierre Monnet encounter, involved this. Still, perhaps the beings were just collecting samples and paralyzed Maurice to protect themselves. By all accounts, Maurice had no further encounters with the beings, and his temporary health problems would subside. Maurice, in time, was finally able to start staying awake for long periods and got back to tending to his lavender farm. On the morning of August 12th, 1983, one of the most famous alien encounters in the town of Aldershot, England would occur. This older case continues to be extremely controversial among ufologists and locals to the area. That said, this close encounter of the third kind is quite interesting and one that deserves examination. In this episode, we will explore the Alfred Burtoo alien encounter. Sometime after midnight on August 12, 1983, 77-year-old Alfred Burtoo grabbed his fishing gear and with his dog Tiny began heading down to the desolate Basingstoke Canal for some night fishing. After checking out a few spots, Alfred finally picked his fishing spot around 1 a.m. Then around 15 minutes later, Alfred would spot a bright light heading toward him. It settled down around 300 feet away, right next to the path next to the canal. After seeing the light, Alfred didn't think too much of it, as there was a military base just nearby. He poured himself a cup of tea and kept fishing, but soon things would get strange. First, Tiny began barking furiously in the direction of the light. Alfred, with eyes on the water, commanded his dog to stop, but Tiny wouldn't. Alfred then glanced over and saw two dark humanoid figures coming in his direction. He couldn't make out specifics on the beings at first, but Alfred wasn't too worried. This is because Alfred had a military background, and he initially believed the figures might just be coming to check on him. As Alfred smoked his cigarette, he began to make out more details on the figures. They kept approaching, and although he wasn't scared, he surely was becoming curious. The beings got closer and closer. Then, he would spot more details. They were around 4.5 feet tall, wearing green coveralls that covered their whole body. He would later recall there were no buttons or zippers, and it was as if the suit was molded to their bodies. Alfred couldn't see their faces, as the beings wore a green helmet with a black visor. The entities would get around 5 feet away and stop. Both stared at Alfred for several moments, while Tiny continued barking. Then they gestured to him to come along. Alfred would begin following them toward the light. One being walked in front, while another one walked behind him. At this time, Alfred was more curious than scared. He would later recall that some of this had to do with his military training, and some of it had to do with his age and failing health. As he approached the ship, which rested in the air, Alfred would climb the stairs along with the beings. As he entered the room, he had to duck down slightly as to not hit his head. The room was all black and had 8 sides and was warmer than the outside. It had a foul smell, which Alfred compared to rotting meat. As he looked around, he would spot no bolts or screws in the walls, and it appeared to be smooth all over. During this time, Alfred could see the beings out of the corner of his eye. Then he heard some sort of noise, and the beings disappeared behind the wall. It's not clear if they just went through it, or a silent door just slid open, but now Alfred was standing in the room, all by himself. After a few minutes, in the middle of the room, a large shaft rose up from the bottom. Right next to it were 2 more beings, almost identical in appearance to the first 2. The shaft was large, around 4 feet in circumference. Then Alfred would be instructed to come over and stand under the light. He couldn't see any light, though, in the room. He stepped over to the right, and an amber light was right on him. It was glowing from ceiling to floor. He stepped into the light with no hesitation. While the light was shining on him, one of the beings would ask his age. Alfred responded that he would be 78 at his next birthday. He was instructed to turn around, and once he did, the being said, "You can go. You are too old and infirm for our purposes." Somewhat surprised, he left the craft and went back to his fishing spot. There he would grab a sip of tea and notice about an hour had passed. Alfred alleged to be unfazed by the experience and got back to fishing. As he was doing this, he would hear a noise from the craft and also see a bright white light. The craft then shot off into the night sky. Shockingly, Alfred would continue to fish all night, and then around 10 a.m. several policemen would walk by. He would mention the craft in his experience, and astonishingly, one of the policemen didn't seem surprised, and even mentioned it was probably here to check out the military base. As the weeks progressed, Alfred found himself thinking more and more about that night in his experience. He wasn't sure of many things, but he did want answers. In October of that year, he decided to reach out to the local newspaper, the Aldershot News, in hope that someone else had seen the craft that night, or perhaps had had a similar experience. Alfred wouldn't find any other witnesses, but the event would draw the attention of several ufologists, such as Timothy Good, who would investigate the case. Good believed Alfred and thought he was telling the truth, although he wished that he would have tried to ask more questions to the beings. What can we make of this incredible story by Alfred Burtoo? Like many cases, there appears to be some things that make it seem genuine, while other aspects that make it seem fabricated. Many skeptics have questioned the story at hand. Some asked how Burtoo was able to remain so calm through the event. Also, what about his dog? It seemed to stay behind at the fishing spot, but some think the dog would have insisted on coming along. In addition to this, it's never good from a credibility perspective to wait months to report a story like this. This is somewhat of an unfair criticism, as it's understandable how people just want to move on with their lives. Still, Alfred was 77 and didn't seem to be scared of much. Several things in the story also align with other UFO reports. For one, the beings were near a military base. It's well documented, even in present day, that UFOs seem to get spotted near military installations. There's various theories on this, which include scary ones, like they are gathering intelligence data and assessing our defenses, and other ones suggesting they are just curious about our capabilities. One interesting case that has incredible similarities is the 1971 Finland forestry alien encounter, which we covered on this channel not too long ago. In that case, the being is described almost exactly the same way. The being in that case had green coveralls with a green helmet and a black visor. The only difference between these two cases, in terms of the beings, is that in the Finland case, the beings were described as 2 feet tall, while Alfred said they were around 4 feet. The Finland case happened 7 years before Alfred's encounter. Alfred alleged in the encounter the beings didn't want him because of his declining health. This is something we've seen in other cases as well, and not too surprising. Alfred had mixed emotions on this decision by the beings, though, as a part of him wanted to travel through the universe and get to do things few have done. With his declining health, Alfred would die several years after the encounter. There's rumors that a strong military presence now controls the area where the event occurred. It's reported to be tough to get into and out of, and some speculate the military has recovered crafts or possibly been in contact with the beings. Of course, none of this is known for sure. While we might never get the answers we want in the Alfred Burtoo incident, it surely is an interesting case to examine. It's been speculated by some that hybrid human-alien beings walk among us. Often, it is thought these beings look just like humans, except perhaps having a few peculiar characteristics, such as different eyes. In addition to this, the beings are said to usually possess odd personality traits, such as their speech, posture, and gestures. Every so often, though, a case arises where human-like beings are spotted, and it's fairly obvious they are not of this planet. In this episode, we will dive into a story from the state of Missouri in which hotel workers encountered something while working. In time, this little-known case has come to be known as the 1970 Simpson Incident. On May 15, 1970, Missouri resident Dorothy Simpson was working at her job, a hotel front desk clerk in the suburbs of St. Louis. The night had been fairly typical and somewhat slow for Dorothy. She had performed her usual tasks, such as checking billing statements, checking in guests and answering phone calls. However, her night was about to get much more strange. Sometime during the evening, Dorothy was looking down and would hear a strange whistling sound. She looked up and would be surprised to see 4 humanoids standing right in front of her. The scene was bizarre, to say the least. There were 4 beings whose appearance was very peculiar. They were all very short, about as tall as the desk, which was around 3.5 feet. There was a man, a woman, a boy, and a girl. All looked very similar, as if they were part of the same family. The 2 males wore tailored suits, and the females wore peach dresses. The hair looked faked on all the entities, and Dorothy would later say she thought they were all wearing wigs. Their skin was pale and the beings' eyes looked lifeless. In sum, the beings seemed to possess enough characteristics to pass as humans, but anyone who really looked at them knew they clearly weren't. The man then spoke in a high-pitched tone and stated,
"Do you have a room to stay?"
Dorothy responded they did have rooms and informed them of the price. The strange man, though, didn't seem to understand what she had said. He turned toward his family and looked, trying to see if they understood, yet none did. The beings then all just looked back and stared at Dorothy. It's not clear what happened here, if they were trying to read her thoughts or hoping she would just hand the keys. Dorothy remained quiet though, and there was an uncomfortable silence. The man finally reached into his pocket and pulled out a stack of $20 bills and put it on the table. The bills though looked brand new, and Dorothy suspected they might be counterfeit. She quickly tested them, but they proved to be genuine. Dorothy took $40 to cover the stay and gave back the rest of the money to the man. She next asked him to sign his name, but the man was so short he couldn't sign it on the desk. Dorothy asked his name, to which he replied, Abel, and Dorothy signed it for him. At this point, the man would step forward. Dorothy, who usually wore glasses, hadn't had them on at this point. As he got closer, she could make out more details on his face. It was very strange and looked doll-like. She asked the man, "Where are you from?" The small man looked upward and pointed toward the sky, saying, "We are from up there." Right as he was saying it, though, the woman stepped in, pushing his hand down, and said, "We are from Hammond, Indiana," giving a street address as well. Then the woman would ask if there was anywhere to eat, and Dorothy showed them where the hotel restaurant was. At this point, the beings walked over to the restaurant, and other members of the hotel staff began to notice the beings. The manager in particular noticed them and went back to speak with Dorothy about her interaction. Dorothy showed the names and addresses they had given, and the manager insisted she look it up to see if they were real. After doing this, Dorothy and her manager would discover the address and the name were both fake. During this time, another employee would go into the parking lot looking for their car with an Indiana tag. He wouldn't find any though. The strange being surely stuck out in the restaurant. The adult's chin barely reached the table. In addition, their mannerisms and conversations with the hostesses and servers was extremely bizarre. For example, the man would ask where the bread and milk came from. The beings would eventually order milk and peas, along with one small steak for the small man. Even more strange, though, was how they ate. The beings would use their knife and pick up peas individually, essentially stabbing them and putting them in their mouth. While eating, they made a loud sucking sound. The man at one point struggled to get down the steak, even though it was cut up into very small pieces. After they ate, they handed the server a $20 bill, and when she returned with their change, they had all disappeared. The server had clearly explained the cost and billed to the group. Soon they would be found by the elevator, but the family was extremely frightened to go inside it. The bellhop had to assure them it was safe to get in. The bellhop escorted them to their room, and when they went in, he turned on the light, but then the man started yelling at the bellhop, telling him that the light is going to damage the children's eyes. The bellhop was so scared at this point he ran out of the room and went down to tell the manager and Dorothy of his experience. The employees all convened in the hotel lobby discussing the strange guests. They agreed to watch them depart the next day and see if they could find anything else about them. The next morning the guests were nowhere in sight. Eventually staff knocked on the door, and upon entering, there was no one to be found. This was especially confusing to the hotel staff, as there was only one door in and out, and each time it opened, it alerted the front desk. One member of the staff would eventually reach out to ufologist John Schroeder, who was based out of St. Louis. Schroeder would visit the hotel and interview the staff that interacted with the beings. He would state they all sounded genuine and was of the opinion that they were telling the truth. What can we make of this strange case and the being's intentions? It seems more likely than not that something not human visited the hotel that evening. By all accounts, the being's behavior seemed pretty typical of what we would expect. The men wore formal clothing, had trouble communicating, had no car, and didn't understand where food came from. In addition, the man seemed to accidentally state where they were from. The beings also seemed to disappear from the hotel without a trace. One other thing to point out too is that multiple employees reported the same thing. Still, critics of the case have another theory, that the parents were simply dwarfs and that the beings were foreign who had difficulty speaking English. Critics say the four were simply out-of-towners and that the hotel staff blew the strangeness out of proportion. For the food question, perhaps they wondered what part of the country or which farm supplied the food. While critics bring up some good points, it doesn't explain everything though, like where was their car and also the appearance. Dwarves' faces look human, and all the witnesses reported these beings to have very strange physical characteristics, resembling dolls. Assuming the four were not of this world, this then raises the question around their motivation. Were these ETs simply on a fact-finding journey, or some kind of experiment to see what checking into a hotel was like? It certainly seems possible, and a hotel in a pretty desolate area outside St. Louis seems like a pretty good place to try it. There seems to be more and more cases and evidence where these beings want to learn human culture as well as do experiments. In the future, we'll cover more of these interesting cases where beings appear to be trying to learn aspects of human civilization. There's been a number of cases we've covered on this channel where individuals who've seen a UFO or had a close encounter of the third kind have reported hearing a strange buzzing sound from the craft. It's a unique detail that we believe adds credibility to the case, and one we see time and time again, albeit in many cases crafts are reported to hover silently. In this episode we will cover a little known case from the 1950s that has several credible aspects to it. This close encounter of the third kind has come to be known as the 1954 Carpenter encounter. In July 1954, around 5 a.m., Harold Carpenter was laying in bed half asleep when he would hear a strange buzzing sound. Carpenter resided in a rural area just outside Kent, England, and had heard the bizarre noise for several straight mornings. This time though, Carpenter decided it was time to go see what the noise was. He got dressed and went outside, being very quiet as to not scare off whatever it was. As Carpenter stepped outside, he would hear the noise coming from the southwest, an area known as Sunny Calvert. He began walking in that direction and soon would begin heading down a hill in the thick brush. The noise continued to get louder and louder, and soon Carpenter was able to make out visual contact. Down the hill, Carpenter spotted the object and would describe it as mushroom-shaped without a bottom. The UFO was hovering around 10 feet above the ground, and it was gray with a diameter of around 20 feet. Carpenter would continue to approach it cautiously. As he got closer, he definitely could see for certain the object was hovering. Then, just underneath it, Carpenter would spot 5 humanoid beings below the craft. The entities were around 4 feet tall and were walking around with some sort of jars. They appeared to be using something like tweezers and were taking samples of things like twigs and leaves. They stayed very close to the craft as it hovered just above them. Sometime when Carpenter had seen the beings, the humming sound had stopped. Interestingly, like so many other cases, the beings wore a one-piece tight-fitted suit that covered their whole body. The being's face looked human, but it was devoid of any emotion. This has led some to speculate the entities were robots and were created to blend in just in case someone witnessed them. Carpenter would say their noses were different, appearing pig-like, and he wasn't sure if they had ears as he couldn't see any. As he was watching the beings, Carpenter kept moving closer and closer until he finally was around 10 feet away and staying somewhat hidden. The beings had been looking down for the most part, but then one suddenly looked up and saw Carpenter. He stared at him with its eyes, devoid of emotion, and without even signaling the others, they stopped taking samples. The craft then descended down, and all the beings boarded. The craft then slowly ascended, and there was a white light that flashed, and instantaneously, it flew away. What can we make of this close encounter of the third kind? It has many similar characteristics we see in other cases, such as the buzzing sound and the gray tight-fitted suits that we see often. In addition, there are numerous cases where beings have been seen taking samples. One such case we covered on a previous episode happened in 1967 in Cusack, France. A boy and his sister spotted a craft and some beings taking samples. One of the big questions in this case concerns the beings. It seems that looking so similar to humans, they were either robots or possibly hybrid beings. Many speculate that hybrid beings live among us, although there seems to be no proof supporting this. It's not known if Harold Carpenter ever had any more close encounters or woke up again to a buzzing sound. Still, if there's any lesson to be learned from this case, it's that if you hear a buzzing sound in the woods, walk the other way. In 1954, a strange alien encounter would occur just outside the town of Masse in Norway. 2 women would interact with a strange good-looking man and watch him board a craft and fly away. On August 20th, 1954, in Ceydalen, Norway, 24-year-old Edith Jacobsen, her sister, Asta Solvang, and her uncle, Havlon Jacobsen, walked over into some fields to collect some wildflowers. After some time, their uncle walked away, and soon the 2 girls were all alone. Then, the 2 women would spot a strange-looking man walking toward them. The situation was a bit odd because the women were in a pretty desolate area with very few people around. The man, though, looked friendly, appeared to be waving, and the 2 women decided to walk toward him. As they got closer, they could make out more details on the man. He wore green coveralls that went up to his neck and didn't appear to have any buttons. Still, what really surprised the women was the man had long, light brownish blonde hair. He also had skin with a goldenish color. The women noted he had clean hands that looked manicured. The man smiled and waved, and the women attempted to shake his hand. However, the man quickly slid his hand across their palms. He then spoke in a strange language to the women. It's important to note here, between the 2 women, they spoke half a dozen languages and also had knowledge of a few more. The language he spoke, though, was like nothing they had ever heard. They later described his speaking as like a sing-song manner. In general, despite being strange and the communication hurdle, the women were impressed with the man and his polite manner. At this point, the being pulled out something like a pen and paper. It began to draw what appeared to be stars, and most likely our solar system. The man would show them Earth, and also point to another planet or star, one the women didn't know. This could have been the being's home, and surely had some type of relevance, although the women weren't sure exactly what it was. At this point, the man signaled for the women to follow him back through the woods. The woman hesitated at first, but then obliged. Up until this point, they believed the man was human, but a foreigner and just strange. That would soon change though. As the women walked through the woods, they eventually came to an opening in a field. There, an oval-shaped silver craft sat. It was around 15 to 20 feet in diameter, 6 feet in height. The women were curious, and one began walking closer toward it, but as they did, the being signaled for them to stop and not get too close. The being then went underneath the craft, opened up a hatch, and he would enter. The craft soon began to rise, spinning quickly, and after reaching about 100 feet, the women watched as it shot off into the sky. After the encounter, the women would notify the police. However, there wasn't much evidence at the scene, other than some indentations in the soil. There's a couple interesting things that stick out from this case. First is that the being appeared to be a Nordic alien, or tall white. The legend of Nordic aliens began the same year as this event, coincidentally, in 1954. Then, a mother heard strange noises coming from outside. She initially dismissed the noises as she thought it was her 2 children messing around in the yard. The mother then went to check from the window and found her children staring at the sky. The children told her that they saw something flying around above their house. Then she spotted the object. It was a UFO with Nordic aliens staring at them. Shocked and terrified, the mother pulled her kids inside the house to keep them safe. Moments later, she stepped outside, and the object flew away. It's unknown what their motive was for watching them, but some speculate that the Nordic aliens were examining the Earth. Since the first sighting, encounters with Nordics mostly happened in Europe during the 1950s. Nordic aliens are usually described as having a human-like appearance and closely resembling people from Scandinavian countries. It is said the species are about 6 to 7 feet tall, pale, with blonde hair and blue eyes. They are also said to be very skinny with long legs, large foreheads, and often being physically attractive. Needless to say, the women's description checks most of these boxes. One other thing to point out is Nordic aliens are sometimes described as being magical with telepathic powers. Many people who have encountered them say they're paternal, watchful, smiling, affectionate, and youthful. Unlike gray aliens, the Nordic species is described as being friendly toward humans and simply curious about our civilization. Still, some question this and believe that Nordics' intentions are actually malevolent. In the late hours of April 4th, 1977, around 1:30 a.m., a 52-year-old woman was sitting outside and relaxing on the hospital grounds of the Veterans Administration just outside Tucson, Arizona, when suddenly the woman would hear a strange buzzing sound from the sky. As she looked up, she would see a bright oval-shaped craft around 40 feet across and 10 feet high. The craft had a pinkish tint toward the top, and also there was some sort of device that looked like a periscope protruding on the right-hand side. The craft was making a buzzing sound, and as it landed, the noise would die out. At this time, a humanoid would seem to appear from nowhere right in front of the craft. The being began walking toward the woman. The entity was tall, well over 6 feet, and wore a one-piece tight-fitted silver suit. As it approached the woman, she would fixate on its eyes as if she was being hypnotized. The eyes were dark, and telepathically the humanoid began to speak with her. It said, "I am Enlil. I want to talk with you. Come with me." The woman was in some sort of trance and got up, following Enlil. It's not clear what happened next, as she couldn't remember, but the witness next found herself aboard the craft. The woman would walk down a hall and into a room which would have 4 more beings. These beings were somewhat different though than Enlil. They were shorter, around 4 to 5 feet tall, and had one-piece suits with a brown color with boots. The beings were working with 2 in front of something that resembled a control panel and another in front of a monitor. The woman was then asked to sit down, and Enlil offered the woman a drink. It was an aluminum cup with something that resembled milk. It is believed this was some sort of drink, like either a truth serum or containing chemicals to get her to relax. This is because next Enlil would begin to question her. Many of these questions were quite personal, and some of the questions were hypotheticals. For instance, Enlil asked her about facing death and how she would deal with it, and the witness stated she would accept it. In response to this, Enlil stated she was one of the developing ones, and there are many of you scattered all over the planet. The being also stated that they would be coming back for her, to which the woman asked when. Enlil stated it was not for her to know. At this point, the woman realized the voice sounded somewhat robotic, and perhaps the being was. Enlil would ask questions for a period of what appeared to be around 30 minutes. Then, as quickly and suddenly as she appeared in the craft, the woman was now out of it. She was now in the street, just in front of the VA hospital grounds. She was confused how she got there, and thought perhaps she was sleepwalking or something. However, one thing would lead her to conclude the event did occur. Her shoes were brand new she was wearing that day. When she arrived home, she noted that her shoes were now scuffed up and had dirt all over them. The damage to the shoes seemed to suggest she had been somewhere else, as they were scuffed up pretty bad. Some have suggested she might have sleepwalked into the desert area and walked back, messing up her shoes. This could be possible. Unfortunately, in this case, the woman chose to remain anonymous, which isn't that uncommon. This case does have several downsides to it in terms of credibility. For one, no one else appears to have seen or reported the craft, which she said was very bright. Also, her shoes could have been dirtied up if she had sleptwalked out into the desert or another muddy area. Still, many of the details of the case jive with other UFO sightings. The craft made a buzzing sound. Also, the being seemed to resemble a tall white, albeit the eyes were different. In addition, the craft is very similar to what is reported time and time again. In sum, this case does appear to have credible aspects to it, albeit it would be stronger if more investigation and details were available. On March 28, 1967, David Morris, then age 19, a factory worker who worked in Kent, Ohio, was driving back home to the town of Munro Falls. Around 2:30 in the morning, Morris was driving west on Little River Road and soon began to approach a small hill. As he began to crest it, he would spot a bright orange light up ahead. At the top of the hill, he would notice the craft was in the field to the left of him. Floating just several feet over the ground, the UFO was cone-shaped, around 25 feet tall and 12 feet wide. At this point, David slowed his car a bit, examining the craft. As he was watching it, something would grab his attention out of the corner of his eye. Right down the road, around 50 feet ahead, there were 5 beings on the road. David was still going pretty fast, so he attempted to slam his brakes from hitting them, but was unable to. He would hit one of the beings on the right side of the car. The other beings were back just a bit further and looked over. They were around 3.5 to 4 feet tall and glowing orange like the craft. At this point, David realized whatever they weren't human. A terrified David then slammed on the accelerator and sped off. The next day, David would come out and examine his car. There was a dent on the front side of the car. He would soon tell his story to a local reporter who would notify NICAP, and they would investigate and record the event. It's not known what these beings wanted or were doing, but it seems this was a one-off event for David. One interesting thing to note about this case is David spotted an ice cream cone UFO shape. This is somewhat unusual, but not unheard of. Fascinatingly, about 15 years earlier, a young military pilot named Thomas Mantell, flying over the state of Kentucky, would be ordered to investigate a strange craft in the sky. The craft was cone-shaped, and Mantell would track it and then eventually crash, costing him his life. It's not known if Mantell passed out or whether the strange craft caused the crash. Luckily for David, though, he didn't meet the same fate. In 1964, there was a rash of UFO sightings that occurred in the United States. That year, for the first few months of the year, UFO sightings were down, and there weren't many reports of strange crafts in the sky. However, as spring and summer rolled around, there would be an explosion of sightings. In addition to this, unlike many other UFO flaps, in many of the sightings, the UFOs would hover to the ground, land, and sometimes a close encounter of the third kind would occur. In today's episode, we will examine a case that occurred from the state of New Mexico in 1964. The incident garnered massive media attention and was investigated by Project Blue Book and has never been debunked. This case has become to be known as the Lonnie Zamora Incident. On April 24, 1964, around 5:45 p.m., New Mexico police officer Lonnie Zamora was out on patrol when he would spot someone speeding. Lonnie began to pursue the individual chasing him, eventually going out to the remote desert in Socorro. As Lonnie was in pursuit, he would suddenly hear a roar and see a blue flame to the southwest, around half a mile away. At this point, Lonnie stopped his pursuit of the speeding car and began heading toward the direction of the explosion. He would soon turn down a dirt road, and believing it might have been a dynamite shack that exploded, he radioed headquarters of the event. However, as he got closer, he would be confused at what he was looking at. Around 150 yards away, he would spot a white object, which he believed was a white car turned over. Zamora kept approaching the object and climbed to the top of a mesa. He then got out of his vehicle and would be stunned to see a silver, egg-shaped shiny craft with 4 landing legs. Just outside there appeared to be 2 small humanoids. The beings wore white overalls, were around 4 feet tall, and had no facial features. Lonnie would head back to the car and try and radio again, but just got static. As he turned around, the small humanoids were gone. The craft began to ascend, and a blue flame shot out the bottom. Lonnie would then run behind the car and watch as the craft hovered into the sky. It remained there for a few minutes, hovering silently, and then quickly flew away. A stunned Lonnie would then question to himself what he actually saw. After a short time, with the radio working again, he contacted his good friend Sergeant Sam Chavez of the New Mexico State Police and asked him to come quickly. Chavez would later recall when he arrived, the two would go inspect the scene. There were large indentations in the ground, around 9 inches deep, 8 inches long, and 9 inches wide. The 2 policemen would note there were no human footprints around anywhere, yet there were some circle indentations. Soon the U.S. Army would send Captain Richard T. Holder to investigate. Holder noticed the unusual marks in the sand, and a bush burned to a crisp on only one side. He would later state, "Everything we saw seemed to support the story that Officer Zamora recounted. Nothing gave me the slightest hint that he did this as a hoax or cooked it up for fame or fortune." Project Blue Book would investigate the incident as well, and they noticed the burn marks and the strange scene. They were also quite impressed with Zamora and his story. Project Blue Book was the U.S. Air Force's official inquiry into the UFOs, and from 1952 to 1969, they investigated over 12,000 UFO cases. Of the 12,000 they investigated, only 700 were documented as unexplained. The Zamora incident is one of those cases. J. Allen Hynek, a very well-known astronomer and UFO researcher, would examine the site too, at the request of the U.S. Air Force. He would state he believed Zamora, and would note the physical evidence at the scene indicated something probably happened there. As mentioned, this case got tons of press and attention. It eventually got so bad for Zamora that he stopped fielding interview requests from the press and ufologists. Zamora would later work as a gas station attendant and would finally pass away in 2009. Over the years, there's been a number of theories on what happened. Skeptics have proposed that the entire incident was faked by local college students. Still, this doesn't explain the noise and humanoid that Zamora witnessed. Another explanation that has been put forth is that Zamora saw some type of mirage. This as well suffers from flaws, as it doesn't explain the noise Zamora heard. One explanation that this was a top-secret military craft. This explanation seems plausible, but doesn't really explain the humanoids being so small and also devoid of facial features. In addition, if it was two humans walking around, why were there no footprints found at the scene? It is important to point out too that Zamora and Sam Chavez were trained to handle crime scenes and would know how not to disturb the site. The final theory, and probably most likely, was the craft was either extraterrestrial or perhaps from another dimension. The case shares many similarities with other UFO cases. This includes the silver-shaped craft and also the important detail the beings wore overalls or something similar. We see this type of clothing in many other cases, some of which we have covered on this channel. Still, the most interesting aspect of this case probably is the description of the beings. The beings seemed to resemble classic gray aliens at first, but of course had no facial features, or perhaps they were very small. The fact that these entities were faceless is interesting, but we should point out cases of faceless aliens are not unheard of. That same year, in the summer of 1964, an older woman in Lancashire, England, saw a bright orange spear silently explode outside her residence. Later that night, the woman went to bed, and an almost faceless entity appeared in the bedroom. She estimated it to be around 5 feet tall. All this said, this case continues to be examined today. Interestingly, the site of the incident has been modernized with walkways to make it more accessible for tourists. However, the site is actually a quarter of a mile from where the incident actually occurred. This is due to reports of radiation present at the original site. It's not known if this is true, but perhaps there might be some element of truth to the rumor. For more than a decade, a young Canadian man would struggle with health issues and insomnia. The man was lost and couldn't quite seem to get his life together. Something was off, yet the man couldn't quite put his finger on it. Then one day the man picked up a copy of Bud Hopkins' book named Missing Time, and suddenly the man knew why he had been having problems. In this episode, we will explore this incredibly strange alien abduction from Canada, a case that has come to be known as the 1973 bandwagon alien abduction. Sometime in 1973, in Jordan, Ontario, 4 members of a Canadian band wrapped up a show at Alice's restaurant and began moving their instruments outside to their van. As they were packing it up, a strange man would approach the group and inquire whether he could grab a ride with them. The band didn't recognize the man, nor did they see him while they were playing their gig. Regardless, the band agreed to take the man, a decision that would haunt band member Thomas Campbell for years. While it's not certain that this person was not human, as we will see, all signs point to some sort of connection to the events that would happen to the band members. As the van pulled out of Alice's restaurant, the group began driving down a service road, with band member Guillaume driving and the drummer and shotgun. The other two band members, including Tom, were in the back with the strange man. It's not known specifically why they took this route, and we will discuss later perhaps they were subconsciously influenced. As they were driving down the road though, the driver would suddenly spot strange lights up ahead. He didn't think too much of it at first, a common first impression when individuals first spot bright UFOs in desolate areas. However, as they drove closer, Guillaume would suddenly slam on the brakes. Thomas, who was in the back, would yell, "What's going on up there?" Guillaume responded, "I think you better come up here and take a look at this." The band members would all climb up, all except the strange man. There, the group were stunned to see a silver metallic craft blocking the road, and after some debate, decided to drive back to Alice's restaurant for the time. However, when Guillaume tried to turn the car around, he lost control of it. The car froze and then began hovering toward the craft a bit closer until it was around 30 feet away. While the frightened group watched in silence, the strange man sat in the back as if he knew this was going to happen, and perhaps even more frightening, he had led them there. As they looked upon the craft, a hatch opened up. The drummer would spot the beings, and they would exit the craft. As the men sat in the van, the beings walked to the side of the van, and the band members watched as the beings tried to open the side door, but with no luck. Tom would see one of the creatures head right by the window. At some point during this commotion, the strange man would open the back door, and the band would be stunned to see four beings. They had white grayish skin with large black eyes. The beings had only 3 fingers, all of which were quite long. The beings were short, being around 4 feet tall, and also interestingly were reported by Thomas to smell like aftershave. This is a detail which we will discuss later in the video. One of the beings, who appeared to be the leader, climbed in the van. It was dark and tough to make out details, but telepathically the alien communicated to the men it came in peace and not to be afraid. The being asked the crew if 3 of them would come with them so they could run some tests. The group communicated telepathically they would. As the being first climbed out of the van, it would knock off some musical equipment onto the ground. The frightened drummer assured the being, who Thomas called the captain, that the drummer was okay. When Thomas grabbed some recorders to bring on board, the other band members were terrified and couldn't understand why he was bringing it. The captain read their thoughts and assured them it was okay to bring. Thomas, along with the bassist and drummer, would exit the craft and follow the beings. They walked through an egg-shaped door of which the drummer would bang his head hard upon entering. The captain checked to see if the drummer was okay, letting him know they could heal him. Once inside, the trio walked down a hallway, and this led to a room with 3 silver-colored cots. They were instructed to take off their clothes. Thomas asked if they could keep their underwear on, and the captain obliged. At this point, the bass player took off his pants, but had on long johns. The trio would then laugh at the situation, and according to Thomas, the beings even seemed to understand the humor of the situation. The situation seemed to indicate that the band members felt quite comfortable at this point, yet whether they should have is debatable. At this point, the aliens brought in a cart with metal instruments and other devices on it. One of the beings would first grab some sort of light device and shine it on Thomas's skin. Thomas didn't see the light, but as he looked at his skin, he could see everything: veins, arteries, bones. Thomas then laid back on a table, and the beings would do the same scan of his whole body. Next, Thomas was asked to look at a light. It seemed to hypnotize him, and wipe his memories. Once Thomas and the other band members woke up the next day, they would forget the events. However, this story is far from complete. For the next 10 years, memories of this event were blocked for Thomas, and presumably also for the other band members. Then sometime in the early 1980s, Thomas would read Bud Hopkins' book, Missing Time, and memories of these events would come back. It's not evident what triggered it specifically, or if the events all came back at once, like what happens sometimes from people suffering from amnesia. That said, he couldn't recall everything. He still had missing time and events that he couldn't recall, and for that, he would reach out to Bud Hopkins, who would arrange a hypnotherapy session with therapist Dr. Aphrodite Clammer. Working with Dr. Clammer, Thomas would recall that night, after he was hypnotized by the strange object, he was taken to another room. Thomas was laying down and around 5 aliens would wheel over a large machine with several different types of arms, with hoses and instruments. The beings would check over his whole body, taking hair and skin samples and putting them in tubes. After this, Thomas was told to dress, and the other 2 men joined him. Altogether, the beings would ask the men if they had any questions for them. One of the band members asked, "Are you from outer space?" To which the beings responded, "Yes." One other question was, "Do you have bases on Earth?" The captain would respond, "Yes, we have many bases on Earth, some underwater, some in desolate areas where few people go. We have one here," pointing out to one of the portholes towards Lake Ontario. The next question Thomas would ask seemed to surprise the beings. What is the true religion on Earth? The beings were perplexed and answered, "Why would you ask a question like that?" Thomas responded by stating they were intellectually superior. The beings would state, "There's no correct religion on Earth," which seemed to surprise Thomas. 2 of the band members were then escorted out, with Thomas staying behind. The experience appeared to be a positive one, with the drummer smiling and waving back at the beings as he walked toward the van. Inside the ship, Thomas recalled he was going into a trance-like state and was overwhelmed with feelings of joy. Thomas was told that he had a special mission in helping their work and would be a beacon of light to people around him, helping people appreciate that aliens are real and that it was important work to do. He was then brought out of the trance-like state. Thomas then remembered the recorders in the bag, and he showed them to the beings. The being said, "What are these?" "Musical instruments. We play them for our entertainment." The being responded, "How do you play them?" Thomas said, "You blow air into them." Oddly, the alien didn't understand what it was being told. Thomas then put on a demonstration playing the recorder. The alien seemed to like it, and Thomas gave him one of the recorders as a souvenir. The being didn't understand what a souvenir was, though. As Thomas explained and gave it to him, he would notice the being had 3 fingers and nails that were long and curved down. The captain would then offer to walk Thomas back to the car, but Thomas declined. As he began walking back, he noticed his face was itchy, and soon he realized he had been crying. As Thomas came around the back of the van, he noticed that everyone was in a trance, sitting like zombies. The craft then suddenly shot off, and the group slowly began to come out of their hypnotized state. The strange man was now gone, and soon the group began to discuss what exactly they should do next. The drummer would say, "No, we can't report this. Everyone will think we are crazy. No one will believe us, and I don't want to be ridiculed over something like this." The guitarist, who didn't enter the craft, agreed on keeping it a secret too. It is thought the hybrid being stayed in the band and hypnotized the guitarist. Tom disagreed with the 2 and wanted to report the incident, but the group stated that if he did, they would deny the event. Still, perhaps what happened next was the most shocking aspect of this entire bizarre case. As the group was driving home, Thomas kept hearing a voice in his head saying, "You will forget this, you will forget this, you will forget this." Thomas fought it, and he fought it, and then finally, after some time, asked, Once again to the drummer and guitarist, should we report this? The two men were completely baffled and said, report what? The two men had already forgotten the incident. Thomas would return home and that night, still fighting the command, attempted to write down the details of the night, but at some point he forgot and wound up going to bed. As stated, Thomas would recall many of the conscious memories after reading Lost Time, and the hidden ones through hypnosis. It's not known 100% how or what exactly triggered the memory recollection, but something in that book did. That said, what can we make of this fascinating close encounter of the fourth kind? The case has many interesting characteristics and elements that we see often in other cases. Perhaps the most interesting is the aspect of mind control. The beings seem to be able to clearly control the emotions and perceived experiences of the band members. In addition, they were able to block certain memories, while they seemed not too concerned with others. It's important to point out too that mind control and blocking memories is not really advanced. Even many humans are capable of hypnotizing others and getting them to behave in certain ways. Still, the interesting thing is that some people appear to be very easy to hypnotize, while others not so much. This is certainly relevant in this case, one in which the memories went away quicker for the band members than for Thomas. In addition to mind control and repressing memories, it is thought too the beings are capable of distorting perceptions, leaving many to believe their alien abduction experience was positive. This appeared to happen in this case, but looking at the facts, these men appear to have had their emotions manipulated. It's tough to imagine these band members would agree to be tested like they were. Many of the elements of the case are classic and things we see time and time again. The beings appeared to be grays and the craft was silver-shaped and oval. The craft grabbed them on a desolate road. Perhaps the only strange detail that didn't add up in this case is that the beings were said to smell like aftershave. In many cases, grays are said to stink and smell quite horrible. It's been reported in a number of cases, and often their smell is the one thing most people remember. There are various theories on why they smell so bad. One of them states that these beings are biological, yet have no organs to dispose of waste. Many theorize they excrete their waste through their skin. That said, some believe greys are not biological and are actually robots, and it's something in their technology. Coming back to the case, it's widely believed the hitchhiker was connected to the beings. He was said to look human and didn't act surprised when the craft appeared. He also opened the door, although it seems that the Greys could have probably done this themselves. One of the key questions is around the other band members too. They stated they would not admit the story, but did Bud Hopkins and Thomas try to track them down? Having even a second witness would have really added incredible validity to the case. Coming back to the questions to the beings, of the questions, it's tough to really conclude much. The beings said they were from outer space, but it's possible they live hidden on Earth or in a different dimension. Probably the most interesting question has to do with the bases on planet Earth. It's long been thought ETs have bases on Earth, and we've seen this on prior episodes. The religion question seems open to interpretation as well, although some might see it as evidence we were seeded by something else. Still, perhaps the most frustrating thing about this case is the beings told Thomas he had a special purpose and that he would be instrumental in letting the world know about the beings. We see this in quite a number of cases, and it also draws a lot of criticism for several reasons. The first one being, why don't ETs ever take world leaders or people who have the ability to really change things? Another reason is, why take someone, tell him what they told Thomas, and then wipe his memory? That said, Thomas, after his sessions with the hypnotherapist, was able to uncover many more alien abductions that happened to him. Some of them are quite incredible, and one even involved his father, which isn't that surprising, as there are many cases where multiple family members are taken. In prior episodes on this channel, we've covered numerous cases of individuals spotting massive winged creatures all around the world. There's various theories what these beasts are, but one thing we know for sure is that there have been reports from everywhere. Even more intriguing, quite possibly, is the connection to extraterrestrials, something many have proposed. In today's episode, we will examine a strange encounter from England, a case that has come to be known as the Bat Beast of Kent. On November 16, 1963, on a chilly and clear night, 4 teenagers were walking home from a party on Sandling Road in the county of Kent, England. As they walked, teenagers John Flaxton and Mervyn Hutchinson, along with 2 other unnamed individuals, were rehashing the fun from earlier in the evening. Then, out of nowhere, the group would spot something glowing up in the sky ahead. It was an oval-shaped object, around 10 feet in diameter, and appeared to be descending slowly into the woods of Sandling Park. The teenagers were curious and began heading in the direction of where they believed the object was. They didn't find the object. However, what they did find would haunt them for years. On the edge of the woods, the teenagers heard rustling in the bushes. At first, even though it was dark, there wasn't much concern as they thought it was just some type of small animal. Then, a creature would emerge. It became quickly evident that this was no animal or person. In horror, the teenagers would spot a 5-foot humanoid. It had a pair of large, black feathery wings coming from its back, which was covered in fur. Without question, the most horrifying thing was the being had no head atop its shoulders. Where the neck should have protruded sat a smooth piece of black skin. The feet on the being were gigantic and said to be webbed, similar to a duck. Needless to say, the teens were horrified at the hideous creature. They sprinted away and ran non-stop to the nearest police station in town. When they arrived, all the teens were shaken and out of breath. As the boys recounted the story, the police officers were highly skeptical and believed this was some sort of prank. A few days after the encounter, word would begin to spread around the community about the story. While the police didn't really investigate the matter and just believed it was a prank, people around the community did not share the same belief. Many had strange experiences and seen weird things recently. While a number of residents refused to go on record, some would tell their story. On November 21st, a man named Keith Croucher came forward to share his experience. Croucher stated on the same night the boys had their encounter, he had spotted a strange orb over a soccer field. The soccer field was quite close to where the boys' sighting occurred. Croucher would describe the object as an oddly shaped craft. In addition to Croucher's documented account, another individual would investigate the matter. John McGoldrick would venture into the woods of Sandling Park on November 23rd, just a week after the incident. McGoldrick and a friend wouldn't encounter the beasts, but would discover 3 gigantic footprints in the woods. They were huge, 24 inches long, and around 9 inches in width. In addition to this, they would find a significant path of broken ferna that had been completely flattened. This seemed to suggest that something had walked through the area. McGoldrick went to the press with his story, and soon word began to spread around what he had found. On December 11th, McGoldrick headed back to Sandling Park with several reporters to show them where he had found the footprints. He showed them his findings, and the group searched for more, but had no luck. However, there would be no other sightings of the strange beast, and in time theories would begin to emerge. There are several theories regarding what the Bat Beast of Kent was. One of the biggest skeptics who investigated the case was John Wolfe. Wolfe would interview several of the boys and propose the theory that the teenagers simply saw a crow that night. Wolfe suggested that the bird's features were illuminated in a strange way, which gave the illusion the crow was much larger than it was. He suggested that a passing train provided the light which caused the illusion. Wolf also believed the boys were already worked up after seeing the craft, and thus this made them more susceptible. Still, many have critiqued this theory, as 4 separate witnesses saw the creature and pointed out unique details, such as the beast being headless and also having huge webbed feet. They pointed out that where the neck should have been was a large black patch of skin. In some, details like this cannot simply be created from seeing a shadow, especially from 4 separate teenagers. In general, it appears that Wolf did a thorough investigation and really wasn't able to come up with a very good one. Others have tried as well, but most don't come close to explaining the event. The only possible theory might be that the witnesses lied about what happened. It's surely possible, but based on all the reports and interviews they did, there's not much of a discussion around witness credibility. This includes skeptics who were looking to discredit the case. In addition to many trying to explain the event logically, there have been a number of supernatural theories put forth over the years. The first and most popular is that this being was an ET, with the craft being seen moments before the encounter, and based on the description of the creature, this surely seems possible. There's been numerous aliens, very odd-looking ones, reported over the years, and it's led many to believe that there are multiple alien races visiting us. This surely seems like a strong possibility, although there are several other interesting supernatural ones. One is that the being came from some sort of different dimension. There's been a number of reports of individuals spotting Bigfoot in the woods and witnessing the monster vanish into thin air. Some speculate that this cryptid has never been found because it actually resides in a different dimension. One other theory as well is that this being is or was a cryptid. A cryptid is a species not yet discovered or recognized by modern science. Could this strange creature be extremely elusive and biological in nature? It seems like a possibility, although many things around it don't add up. For example, if it is of this earth, why doesn't it have a head? Some have suggested it lives under the ground, possibly in caves, and doesn't need vision. Perhaps the being got lost and somehow traveled up to the Earth's surface. While these tend to be the more popular theories, there are some other ones too that have been proposed. Some think the being is some sort of mutation or scientific experiment gone wrong, possibly from the military. Others have suggested the creature is or was demonic in nature. While there doesn't appear to be any other cases of winged, headless humanoids, there are a number of winged creatures reported around the world. In the United States alone, there's the Mothman, Batsquatch, Snallygaster, and the Van Meter Visitor, just to name a few. One reason this case is important is that it has to be studied from both a cryptozoology and UFO perspective. Often cases are only examined by one or the other, but it seems researchers are beginning to realize that these cases can't be looked at under one lens. Many cryptids might be ETs, and we also know many UFO cases can contain a paranormal aspect. What can we conclude from this case then? This is a quite popular one from Britain, and with good reason. There were multiple witnesses and physical evidence found as well. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be many cases with this type of entity for whatever reason. Most UFO cases involve Greys and Nordics. Most cryptid cases involve Bigfoots, winged humanoids, or water creatures. We see repeatable trends quite often with many of these cases, especially with Greys and Nordics. All this said, this seems to be a case with many credible aspects, although it's not the slam dunk or the smoking gun that the cryptozoology or UFO community has been looking for. On August 6, 1977, a Georgia man would set off on a walk and have an experience he would never forget. Tom Dawson, a 63-year-old retired auto salesman would spot a UFO and eventually encounter 7 strange beings. The event terrified Tom and almost scared him to death. Right after it, he was so frightened and worked up he had to be hospitalized for hysteria. In this episode, we will examine the frightening alien encounter experienced by Tom Dawson. On August 6, 1977, around 10:30 in the morning, Tom Dawson began walking toward the pond on his property, accompanied by his dogs, to see if he should try and fish later in the day. As Tom walked in the fence that surrounded the pond, he would be stunned to see a UFO suddenly fly in. It began hovering between the trees and settled just a few feet off the ground. Tom was terrified, and to make things worse, just moments after the UFO settled, he found himself somehow paralyzed and unable to move. In addition, his 2 dogs were frozen as well as some nearby cattle. The UFO was around 50 feet in diameter and about 15 feet high. It was hovering silently and had a base color of silver, although there were other colors flashing and changing quickly. It was saucer-shaped, had a dome on top, and also had several portholes beneath the dome. The craft would descend further toward the ground, and then a ramp came down toward the ground. Then Tom would be horrified to see 7 humanoids start descending down a ramp. They were pale, around 5 feet tall, and had pointed ears and pointed noses. Some had tight-fitted silver outfits on, while others wore nothing. The first one to exit the ramp put their foot down softly on the ground, as if it was testing the surface. In other words, it seemed this species had never actually set foot on Earth. There is more support for this theory as well later on, as Tom saw they were collecting soil and leaf samples. Tom noted once the entity was able to plant its foot safely on the surface, the rest followed down the ramp. They approached Tom, and next the beings would perform some type of medical test on Tom. As they spoke some type of gibberish to one another, the beings placed some type of helmet-like device on his head. They also wrapped his midsection with something. While some of the entities were examining him, other ones were collecting samples of the soil and leaves. Once the test concluded, the beings went back up the ramp, the door shut, and the craft flew away at lightning speeds. As the craft flew away, Tom Dawson was released from his paralysis and began running back toward his home. He stopped by his neighbors, but being so worked up, all he could manage to say was spaceship. Tom was eventually taken to the hospital and treated for hysteria. He was given a sedative to calm him down. He would later recall that he believed the entities probably didn't take him because he was older. Tom's story is surely an interesting one and shares many common characteristics with other alien encounters and abductions. The beings appeared to be Nordic aliens, although they were shorter than other reports of Nordics. One other thing to point out is that the paralysis is something else that many other individuals who have these experiences report. Still, most often paralysis tends to be reported while people are laying down, which leads skeptics to say they are experiencing sleep paralysis, a documented medical phenomenon. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this case is that it occurred in the daytime. It's somewhat unusual to get reports of people experiencing these paralysis cases in broad daylight, although it's not unheard of. So did the beings plan to take Tom or not? This is tough to say, as they surely had some type of interest in him. One interesting thing Tom reported was that it appears, since they were hesitant to walk on the soil, they might have just came here for the first time. It's not known if Tom ever came in contact with these entities again. Hopefully, though, he was able to recover from his traumatic experience and enjoy the rest of his retirement.